Violent crime is up in Denver and in major cities across America. You see it reflected in the calls for help from police here. And then there's the number of officers in Denver who can't work the streets because they've been involved in recent shootings. The reason that Colorado's COVID hospitalization numbers are still so high, even with half the population vaccinated. A promise of more transparency from one of the groups collecting donations for the families of the Boulder shooting victims. And the man who ran the 9/11 Victims Fund tells us what he'd do if he was in charge. A cybersecurity expert explains how Colorado companies should handle ransom attacks, as in, not the way his employer did. And the new HOA employees? They're the greatest of all time. Next. The nationwide surge in violent crime that began during the pandemic's first year is still with us halfway through 2021. The violence seen in Denver is similar to other major cities across the country. There are a lot of measures, impacts, many barometers to measure just what is happening and why. One is the incidents in which police shoot or shoot at somebody. DPD's had 5 of those incidents in the last month, most recently yesterday on East Colfax. Here's Marshall Zellinger.
Man's in the hospital tonight after multiple Denver police officers shot him.
And that's when both officers fired at the man.
It ended in a barrage of gunfire near 1st and Perry.
These are just 3 of the 6 shootings where Denver police officers have fired their handguns, each of those 3 in the last month. In all, Denver police alone have 19 officers on what's known as modified duty, while those shootings are investigated and the officers counseled, a process that could take weeks before the officer is allowed back on the street.
There's an investigation that needs to take place. We need to get the answers to what occurred during that particular incident. We also understand that that incident was traumatic for that officer, for those officers that were engaged in that particular incident. So we want to treat that trauma.
Chief Ron Thomas is head of the patrol division. He explained how the department makes up for 19 officers who cannot be on the street by taking officers from proactive policing. For example, instead of making the rounds on East Colfax, those officers will instead respond to calls coming in.
We're actually about nearly 10% above the number of calls for service that we had this time last year. However, we're about 20% down officer-initiated calls for service. The increase in citizen-initiated calls for service is associated with an increase in crime.
Denver looks at the last 3 years to determine if crime is going up or down. Just for a brief snapshot, look at Denver's crime map from June 2017 to June 2020. The darker the color, the more reports of crime. From June 2018 to this month, the map gets slightly darker in certain parts of town.
There are a number of large cities like Denver that are experiencing increases in crime. I would imagine that it's in relation to the pandemic and some of the economic downturn and stressors that are associated with that.
With 19 officers off the street and on modified duty, at least in Denver, we in the newsroom are curious how that compares to other cities. I checked in with Aurora. 19 officers in Aurora are on what's called light duty, meaning officers working the front desk, taking reports or helping detectives with cases. None of those 19, however, are involved in shootings. 8 officers in Aurora are not available for duty because of injuries, about half of those on-duty injuries. And a recent officer-involved shooting in Arvada has 2 of those officers currently on modified duty, Kyle.
And Marshall, we heard Commander Thomas there talk about the idea that the economy is playing into this. And we know that there are links between economic factors and crime. But over the last year, you also had jails not willing to hold people as long. You had issues of police resources that were dealing with protests and other things. So long story short, there's no one simple causal factor.
No, and it was clear in that answer. And I had also asked, could we compare it last year during the pandemic or versus 2 years ago? And that's when he said they look at that 3-year time frame, which gives them a more ballpark. But I don't know that there's any one thing that we can pinpoint. And even if they had that proactive policing going on, if they're not covering shifts, some of the crimes we're seeing, I don't know that you solve proactively. Those are the ones that somebody picks up the phone and say, I am the victim of a crime. Come help me, please.
Yeah, those calls for service up 10%. All right. Thank you, Marshall. About 53% of Coloradans have some protection against COVID via the vaccine right now. 47% are through the vaccination process, about 6% waiting on second doses. Tonight's next question comes from a viewer who goes by G. with more Coloradans getting the COVID vaccine, she wanted to know why COVID hospitalizations in our state aren't lower now than they were a year ago when the vaccine wasn't available. So there are 334 patients hospitalized with COVID right now in our state. You look back to this week in 2020, there were 126 hospitalizations statewide. Nine Health medical expert Dr. Pyle Coley explains why we are seeing almost triple the hospitalizations now, despite the widespread availability of vaccines.
The first is our behavior. So we are far more mobile than we were at this time last year. The second reason, however, a very important reason, is that the strains that are now circulating and dominant here in Colorado are the more aggressive variants. Not only are they more contagious, meaning that they spread more quickly, but some of them are also more virulent, meaning that they're more likely to end you up in the hospital. And these strains weren't around last year at this time. I'm not concerned about it, but I do think that this reminds us that COVID has not gone away.
Goes without saying, the folks who are showing up at the hospital with COVID are unvaccinated. If you have questions, it is our pleasure to find answers for you from the experts. And as we always say, if you're wondering something, somebody else is too. So send those questions via video or voice memo, if you would, to next@9news.com. The nonprofit that collected the most donations following the Boulder King super shooting to benefit those victims has now doubled the amount given out to victims' families in the last 2 weeks. John McKenzie, who lost his wife, Lynn, raised some concerns on this program about the way the distribution of funds was working. He wants the state to take over the process. And he asked Colorado to bring in Ken Feinberg, the attorney who helped distribute funds after 9/11 and the Aurora Theater shooting. Our Steve Steger talked with Feinberg about what an incredibly difficult and highly scrutinized job that is.
It's familiar. It's common. You never get over it.
When tragedy engulfs a community, it usually isn't long before Ken Feinberg's phone rings. Most recently, he was in Denver helping determine compensation for victims who were abused by priests. Before that, he handled the money raised for the victims of 9/11 and the Gulf oil spill. But his first assignment here in Colorado was to determine how to split a victims fund after the Aurora Theater shooting.
We treated all of the deceased, all of the victims of the shooting, received the same amount of money. One size fits all. All lives are equal.
Anyone wounded in that shooting split the rest of the money, determined by how long they were in the hospital.
That wasn't a difficult calculation, one by one by one. No. The tough part is the emotion, like the families that I'm hearing from now in Boulder.
Earlier this month, a group led by John McKenzie, who lost his wife Lynn Murray in the Boulder shooting, called on the governor to appoint Feinberg to split up the more than $4 million raised by the nonprofit Colorado Healing Fund in the name of the shooting. The Healing Fund says it's distributed more than $1.5 million so far, but says its purpose is also to hold money for the long-term needs of the victims. Feinberg says he doesn't know much about the efforts of the Healing Fund, but he comes from a different school of thought.
Long-term need, there's not enough money. There really isn't. And I've found in my own experience, not with regards to Boulder, the sooner you collect the money and distribute it and move on as best you can, that's best.
He says we as a people can be so generous, but we lose sight of the fact that money isn't magic.
I don't care if you give people $20 million. It's not going to heal. It's not going to provide closure. Money is a very hollow substitute for loss.
Now, Feinberg says transparency about funds raised is also crucial. Today, former Republican Attorney General Cynthia Kaufman told me, she actually chairs the board of the Colorado Healing Fund. She told me that the organization will produce a quarterly report of funds raised and funds distributed. She says that decision was made before Mr. McKenzie went public with his concerns. The first report is due on June 22nd, Kyle.
And Steve, this cycle is now familiar. Something terrible happens. People respond with overwhelming generosity. And then the way that the funds are handled does not meet with the approval of some of the families who are simultaneously juggling grief and then their feelings about the process.
Yeah, and Feinberg has handled so many of these. He also was an advisor on funding for Virginia Tech. He helped out with the situation at Sandy Hook. This always tends to come up when so much money is raised in these types of situations. He says from his school of thought, it's best to just get that money out and avoid re-traumatizing people who've already been through so much.
Steve, thank you. Our sense of time, so warped during the pandemic, we have taken to looking back 1 year and just asking the question, what do we used to talk about? A year ago today, Americans could still be fired from their jobs for being gay. Astonishing to think that in the year 2020, that was still allowed. It's only 1 year ago tomorrow that the Supreme Court ruled that LGBTQ Americans are protected from discrimination in employment, part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Also serves as a reminder as we celebrate Pride Month that so much progress was so recent. Suicide is the most common cause of death for young people in Colorado. Robbie's Hope is fighting to fix that, organizing teenagers to talk with their friends and classmates to destigmatize depression and anxiety. And that nonprofit also worked with teens to build a handbook for adults on how to have that tough conversation with people their age. Robbie's Hope will continue and expand its work in our community thanks to you. Next viewers have raised more than $32,000 for that nonprofit in last week's Word of Thanks micro-giving campaign. Your generous donations, plus their hard work and expertise, it will make a difference. You've raised more than $4 million for Colorado's small to mid-sized nonprofits in the last year. A whole bunch of $5 donations piled high. New idea right here every Wednesday. This is not a petting zoo.
And they're so cute, you want to go in here and pet them and touch them. But I got to respect them too.
These are working goats. They're with the HOA. And a cybersecurity expert offers a lesson his own employer could learn from.
It's better to be prepared and be proactive than to have to pay in a reactive stance.
Big organizations in Colorado keep paying ransom to hackers, which leads to, you guessed it, next. Cyber attacks certainly have our attention in a new way. JBS, the global meat supplier based out of Greeley, paid $11 million in ransom after a recent attack. Before that, hackers went after that East Coast gas pipeline, public transit in New York City. Nearly 2 years ago, Regis University paid a ransom to hackers, something that one of its own cybersecurity professors said companies should never do. He talked with our Katie Eastman.
The lesson seems obvious. Don't give the criminals what they want, or they'll come back.
I've never met a thief that I can trust. I don't think you have either. So my recommendation is you never pay the ransom.
But across the nation, companies are not taking Bob Bowles' advice, including the company that he works for. Bowles directs the Center of Information Assurance Studies at Regis University. Nearly 2 years ago, the college paid out a ransom to the people who hacked their system. Regis won't say how much they paid.
As old cowboy logic says, when you're in the hole, stop digging.
But sometimes, he says, companies can't see another way out because they don't have their data on backup servers. Backup servers that are disconnected from the internet and unplugged every night.
So that way, if you were to experience an attack in the middle of the night, then all you got to do is plug back in the uncontaminated, the good backup back into operation.
That way, while data might still be stolen, the infrastructure doesn't go down, and companies don't feel the need to pay to get back up and running. Regis would not tell us if they had backup servers when they paid the ransomware. For Next, I'm Katie Eastman.
Professor Bowles could not speak to us specifically about Regis's cyber attack because he signed a non-disclosure agreement. Regis told us back in 2019 that they'd be using their attack as a lesson for students, just not very specifically thanks to those NDAs.
We are kicking off this last week of spring with temperatures in record territory and lots of sunshine. Little smoke and haze around the area. Our high today 98 now in Denver, 100 in Greeley, 100 in Grand Junction. We go even warmer the next 2 days. High pressure spinning over the Four Corners area, pushing the storm track to the north. Hot, dry weather and high fire weather across much of the western U.S. Any thunderstorms that develop will be high base with wind and lightning and a little bit of hail and not the rain that we need. And so moving through the overnight time period, temperatures very warm in the mid-60s downtown. We get to 100 tomorrow. That breaks the record of 97. Should get to 100 again on Wednesday. That breaks the record of 93. Thursday, an afternoon cool front comes in. We'll take temperatures down 10 degrees Friday, and we put a stray thunderstorm in with slightly cooler conditions for next weekend.
Give a Coloradan a bike, they'll use it for an extreme sport. When we hear from you about HOAs, it's usually a complaint. Not today.
In my opinion, it's good for your mental health to see nature, take care of nature instead of toxicity.
Less toxicity. I think we could all use that. Next. If you don't stay on top of weeding your property, you might hear from your HOA. One of those warning letters that really gets your goat. Or you could get your HOA's goats and let them deal with the weeds. That's what one neighborhood in Parker's doing.
I watch the birds, we have deer, we've got a lot of wild land that the wildlife run through that we're required to get rid of the noxious weeds. We chose to live here in this field. Why we choose to poison the whole area is beyond me. So I just looked up, natural weed control, and goats came up. My name is Sonia Benglin, and I am a retired microbiologist. I'm very passionate about trying to do things more of a natural way. That's where Donnie and Lonnie know light years more than I do.
Well, I'm Lonnie Malmberg, and this is my son, Donnie Benz, and we started this business of using goats as an alternative to machinery and chemicals. The goats eat all the flowers off the top and strip all the leaves off, so that plant has been stopped for its ability to reproduce because it can't go to seed and it can't photosynthesize.
Those two look like they go together up there, the dark and the white.
In the past 5 years, 3 years of the dryness, this soil is in very bad condition, and we have got to condition the soil, and no other form of weed control can do that.
Look at this one, putting on a show here. In my opinion, it's good for your mental health to see nature, take care of nature.
It's a bit healing, like Sonia said, it's you can get some mental clarity being out here with these animals.
My favorite thing about doing this as a profession is being a professional gypsy. And look where I get to camp. If you did that, cops would come. Throw you out of here, and look at me.
May we all love our job that much. That story through the lens of our photojournalist Brian Wendland. Goats are used for fire mitigation across the state because look at them work. They're outstanding in their field. I'm a dad. I can make that joke all day long. The most Colorado thing we saw today is a sport that we have discovered exists. You learn something new every day around here. That's our goal. That and your feedback next. The most Colorado thing we saw today is not something that most of us should try at home. We would injure ourselves. Our viewer Gary was captivated by this bicyclist he spotted along Clear Creek in Golden. What that cyclist is doing is trial biking. Maybe everybody knows this and just not us. It's where mountain bikers try to get through an obstacle course without putting a foot to the ground. This guy's doing a little creekside training. Bike didn't have a seat because it gives the rider more room to contort and swing the bike around. Trial biking was invented in Spain, but it looks like something custom made for Colorado. Send us the most Colorado things you see. Email next@9news.com. Joseph writes in tonight and says, is it possible that the spike in violent crime in major metropolitan cities is a direct result of the effort to defund police? So DPD's budget saw a drop from 2020 to 2021. That was a COVID cutback. That was not related to defunding police. Bloomberg looked nationwide at 34 of the 50 largest cities and found police budgets were down less than 1%.